Welcome to DS Charm School, right? So I'm here with my co-author and friend, Blake Bradford. So what do you say we get this party started, Blake?
Sure thing, Kay.
All right. We're going to talk about simplified accountable structure today. How about that?
Super.
We're actually going to have three parts, and we're going to start with an overview of simplified accountable structure today. Seems to be a hot topic lately, does it?
It really does. I'm getting all kinds of questions about it every week.
We sure are. Whether it is local churches, local church leaders, whether it's the pastor or the council chair, or whether they're already in simplified structure and maybe having a little trouble, or we get a lot of calls from district superintendents. So that's why we've been asked to do this, is just to provide some tools for them. So my name is Kay Cotian. I'm co-author of the resource around simplified accountable structure, also the director of the Greatest Expedition and Impressions Unlimited.
Hey there, Kay. I'm Blake Bradford. I'm a district superintendent in the Arkansas Conference. And I've been working with Kay here on Mission Possible and our previous work, Impact, which is about lay ministry. And it's really exciting to do this resource together for our district superintendents. I know when I was at district superintendent training, AKA Charm School, we got a flood of information and we weren't sure what to do with it, but we knew we needed more tools in our toolbox because we were getting asked questions that we had no idea that the question even existed, much less the answer. So as many tools as we can provide at the fingertips of our superintendents and adjudicatory officers, the better. I know that firsthand. So I'm excited to have this opportunity.
Absolutely. And we've taken a little special focus on district superintendents in this latest resource too, for sure, haven't we, Blake? Yeah.
You bet. So when we start talking about leadership structures, most of us are very used to the inherited structure. We have finance committees, we have ad board, we have PPRC or SPRC or whatever initials we want to call our personnel committee, trustees. And, one question is always, how much time are we spending trying to get permission sideways and all these steps before we can make an actual decision? Now, the thing I want to say early on is, there is a problem with most structures because these inherited structures were not designed for a time such as this. They're not designed for an era of enormous change. They were really designed for an era when not much needed to change. People seem to be showing up in churches. It seemed to be working out quite well. They were designed to make sure nothing too extreme or new happened because all seemed to be going well. Well, we live in a very different era today, and we need more nimble structures. Now, Kay and I always say together, structure's not bad. In fact, we love structure. It's very helpful. Structure is in the form of budgets and finances and calendars and facilities and buildings, but it's also in how leadership gathers and how decisions are made. And structure is a skeleton when we start talking about this leadership structure. And the thing I know just enough about medicine to know that if you're seeing parts of a skeleton outside the body, it's probably not healthy. It's better on the inside and not showing. But for some of our churches and as superintendents, I think we're seeing a whole lot of the skeleton and not much of the muscles on the body. We're seeing a lot of these structures, and that's not particularly healthy. Structure does not need to be the driving force on what we're doing, and that's the idea. Structure's been driving our mission instead of the mission driving the structure. The church exists not for structure's sake, but for the mission of the church to fulfill that disciple-making mission, transforming the world, making disciples of Jesus, making an impact that's God's size. So often when we do these workshops, Kay, I know you have a question you always ask, and that is when you have all these churches in the room, and you say, how many? What was it you always ask? How many different leaders?
Oh, yeah. So of the 4 teams, finance, trustees, SPRC, and your council, what's the total number of leaders that you have working on all of those committees? And the fewest usually is 24 or so, but the largest was 76 people that were tied up in the administration of the church.
Just on
That's the
those
record
standing,
so far. Yeah,
just on those standing committees, 76 folks.
isn't that
I've got a
amazing?
story for you. I have a part-time pastor. She's a retired pastor. And when she landed at the church, that church worships 50 people, and she counted it up, and there were over 50 people involved in leadership structures, which means she was, I don't know how the math works here, but that means people wearing multiple hats, and they were just they spent all their time on committees.
And then who was left to do the ministry, right?
Oh my word.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just the problem.
Yeah.
So that we
Well,
have an opportunity then, and that is the discipline offers an escape clause to these legacy structures. 247.2. The charge conference, the DS, and the pastor shall organize and administer the pastoral charge in churches according to the policies and plans herein set forth, But then there's this extra, this underline. In consultation with and approval of the DS, you can modify the organizational plans, provided that the basic structure of ministry continues. The nurture, the outreach, the witness in the world. As long as you can do that and fulfill all these requirements, you have a lot of flexibility. And so that is what, when we talk about simplified accountable structure, that is really what we're talking about, is how we can utilize this disciplinary passage. So we're not discarding the discipline. We're not tossing it out. I've got mine right here on my desk, ready to be used. We're not tossing it out, but we're using one of the clauses in there for the mission to be fulfilled.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And, Blake, one of the things that I've noticed, and I think one of the reasons that you and I are getting so many calls of late is, the pandemic really amplified the issues with many of our structures in our churches. When we needed to respond, when we needed to pivot quickly, we weren't able to do it in that traditional structure. And so those that, whether they were already in Simplified, but they weren't sure how to work it, or they were in the traditional, and they began to see this isn't working anymore. This is why many churches are saying we need to do something differently. And that is this simplified accountable structure. Now, as Blake was showing you, paragraph 247.2, it's pretty ambiguous of what this looks like. And that's the reason it has really evolved over time, because unlike the traditional structure that is very regimented in how it tells you that you need to put together structure, this doesn't. And so we kind of started in one way, and over the last 10, 12 years, as we have worked with hundreds of congregations across the country, we've kind of figured out what works and what doesn't work. We're continuing to learn what works and doesn't work, but we've learned some things that we're trying to keep other churches from having to fall into the same potholes. We used to talk about single board model. We used to talk about, a unified or the one board model. We no longer refer to it. And it's not just because we just want to change the name for namesake. It kind of got us into some hot water, didn't it, Blake?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Some folks, I guess, decided one board meant we don't need any committees.
Including ministry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Actually had one church that got rid of not only nominations, not only SPRC trustees and finance and the council, but every ministry team went away. I mean, the church almost closed over that misinterpretation. So not only did we change it for that reason to go to Simplified, but we thoroughly believe that accountability is key in this. As a matter of fact, one of the district superintendents that we have been working with recently out of the Oklahoma conference, and I told him that I would give him credit for this. So Reverend Cohen out of the Oklahoma conference, this is the way he always writes it now, is lowercase s's with a capital A, meaning that's how important accountability is. We believe that every church should be really practicing accountable leadership. But definitely when you go to simplification, we must be practicing accountable leadership. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more a little bit later, because I think we don't always understand what that means. So again, we have really concentrated more in our newest resource to help unpack that so that churches understand that a little bit more. So that's the new name. And we've been calling it that probably for the last 4 or 5 years, simplified accountable structure. So that's a language thing that we're trying to help adopt across the country too. No more single board model, no more a unified board or one board, simplified accountable structure. And you'll hear us also, we need another acronym in the church world. So we also refer to it as SAS.
Super. So let's see what is involved. What are we combining here to make this work?
Yeah. So the leadership board, which is what we call this combined leadership team, is the ad council, the SPRC, the finance, and the trustees all come together, and they make up the new leadership board. And we always recommend changing the name. So whatever you call the current leadership team, whether it's church council, ad council, governance board, whatever it is, change the name. That helps your congregation understand that something new has happened. We like the name leadership board. It's kind of generic. We don't necessarily mean you have to use that, but that's the name that we use. But it's all 4 of those administrative teams come together along with those responsibilities. And those roles all come together, and that board has like 4 hats, if you will. They have all of that responsibility, and most of the time there's like, all of those, they spend hours and hours and hours meeting every month, but most of the time they're doing the work that isn't necessarily the work that's meant for those teams, and we're going to unpack that a little bit later. Now, you notice like a 5th thing on this chart here that I think is important for us to talk about a little bit here, is it says work teams as needed. And so when there are special projects, let's say, I always use the example, it's time to put the annual budget together. You don't start with a blank piece of paper and have this leadership board start. It is, okay, it's about time to start working on the budget. So the chair of the leadership board would turn to one of the folks on the leadership board and say, hey, Blake, would you start working on a rough draft of that budget and bring it back to the next board meeting, and grab a couple of people to help you. And the really cool thing about that is you could use somebody else from the leadership board. You could pull somebody that has that kind of expertise from the congregation, or somebody else from the board, but you also have the opportunity to pull somebody in that maybe is from the community. So if you're working on some sort of project that is more community oriented, you have the opportunity to bring anybody in from anywhere to lend that expertise. So you're not limited to just the experience of that leadership board when you have that work team approach. So notice we don't use representatives anymore.
Yeah, and really what that means is, by pulling in expertise and from around the church community and staff and everywhere else, means you don't have to so-called build a board that has one person who's an HR person or one person with finance skills, and you're not trying to compose a board with all these secular skills and we need an attorney for this. No, you're building a board full of disciples of Jesus that have leadership capacity. And then you can bring in as work teams people on an ad hoc basis with all these other expertise. And that broadens your leadership throughout the year, instead of saying, oh, only elected leaders can lead. Well, heck no. Leaders can lead all kinds of ways.
Yeah. And like, as a matter of fact, as you know, that's what we recommend is our mature disciples at the table. And so it changes the dynamics of how we even do nominations, because we're looking at the traits of discipleship rather than those secular skills. And it changes everything about that leadership table then, and what we're able to do. It's a beautiful thing to watch when it happens.
Sure.
Yeah.
The other thing on this slide is leadership board equals the ad board plus SPRC plus finance.
Yeah.
We never say that we don't have a trustees anymore.
Right.
We never say we don't have a staff parish. No, the leadership board is the staff parish. The leadership board is the board of trustees.
Right.
So when you go to the Secretary of State's office in your incorporated body, who are the trustees? Who's the board of directors?
Right.
It's the leadership board. Who's the staff parish committee in this church? It's the leadership board.
Yep.
All these committees continue to exist, but they exist as one body.
Exactly. It's kind of like everybody wears 4 consecutive hats.
I guess you're kind of switching back and forth and putting them on depending on the topic at hand.
Yeah. And at the same time, we're looking through a holistic lens instead of a siloed lens, which I think is a healthier lens.
Sure. The other thing, when people talk about how much time they're spending in these committees, we don't always remember what they're doing is they're taking the same topic and they're running it through every committee. So you think, oh, it takes 4 hours to get XYZ through. Well, that's because you had 4 different groups and they each took an hour. The example we have in the book is the Easter egg hunt, when someone had an idea in January for the Easter egg hunt, making a community event. And by the time they got through all the committees, it was July.
Yeah, exactly. And the leader had lost passion and excitement a long time ago. And do you think they're going to try again next year? Heck no.
That bunny's already hopped off somewhere else by then.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I guess the next question is, if you're going to put all these people, on this board, who all is on it?
Yeah. So again, we're still working within the Book of Discipline, right? It's not like we're going off on a tangent here. So 9 people, because that's maximum in some places, right? So we still want to be in compliance. So it's 9 people, but we're still making sure that we have our lay leader and our lay delegate. So think of 9 people who are serving under those 4 responsibilities. Within those 9 people, one of them will be board chair. We recommend that because nominations will be doing a little bit of a different process. We recommend an application and interview process because of this discipleship piece that we're looking for. We recommend that nominations actually choose that board chair, and that that board chair is also serving in the capacity of that trustees chair. But as we know, the Book of Discipline says that the trustees committee needs to elect their chair on their first meeting of each year. So you really can't, by Book of Discipline, say that they're the trustee. You have to go through that step, but that is our recommendation, is that that's what happens. Many times the board chair is also the one that has the title of lay leader. That kind of makes sense. We also recommend that the board chair is named as, I hate to say SPRC chair, but it's that capacity. We call it SPRC liaison to the district superintendent. The reason for that, again, it's a learning, because we had someone on the team that was that liaison to the district superintendent, and that person was not conveying the information, and there were decisions made without the entire team. So we like things to come in through the chair, kind of like that is the communication channel, if you will. And then of course, if you have chartered United Methodist men and women, then they're part of that nominations process, and youth. Now, because
of May, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Because this is also the trustees' responsibility. The youth need to be of legal age, right? And so usually that's 18 because they have responsibilities that could be signing contracts, right? And and so if they're not 18, they really can't serve as a trustee. So you have to be careful there. So you may have to have someone else, or they have to excuse themselves as a trustee when it comes to legal kind of decisions, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, I've seen them, they put a little asterisk and they say it's a youth member, so they can do everything else but the trustee piece. They can't
Exactly.
vote on any of those items. So
Exactly. And you don't have to have 9 by book of discipline for trustees. So you could still serve in the 9. When you, at some point we had, 9 to, a higher number, but we've just got to the point for simplification that, that 9 just works because there's other committees that you can't have 9, more than 9, and then some can't vote. It's just, again, this is simplified structure. It's just cleaner and easier just to go with 9. And do you see this really big gold box to the side? It's to remind us you still need a separate nominating committee. So this means that there are only 2 committees that require nominations: the new leadership board and nominations. I always say it's kind of funny. The leadership board can't be self-nominating, but the nominations committee is self-nominating, right? But all the ministry teams, that's what's left at this point then, all the ministry teams are not, they are recruited. They are not part of the nominations process. So separate nominations is still required. And then you have the leadership.
yeah, they're selected, not elected, those ministry teams.
Correct.
And actually, we have a chart on that. This is an example of a church flow chart here on the screen. And if you notice, then purple's the leadership board. So you have, Jesus Christ, the Great Commission at top. The church and the charge conference is what connects us to our larger mission in the world. And that's the voting body that approves things. And, at that charge conference level, just as you see in the discipline, the connection to the annual conference, you notice there's 2 things highlighted. That's the leadership board, which serves as trustees and staff parish and finance, and of course the church council. You also have the nominations committee, which relates to the charge conference, but also the leadership board, and pastor's the chair. All this down below, all those lay ministry teams, those are all selected. In other words, they don't have to have terms of office.
Yep.
They can be moved around as needed based upon their capacity and passion and spiritual gifts. I always thought it was funny when we elected a missions chair and stuff. It's like, well, how do we know that that's their passion and that's what God's calling is in their ministry? And then it's like, oh, you've done 3 years, you can't be involved in. Well, no, if they have those gifts, let them lead that way. Yeah. The neat thing about this, when you reduce the administrative committees, you discover that we have all these gifted lay leaders in the church that instead of spending their time at the meeting table are now leading ministry teams. They're leading small groups. They're helping make disciples in on the ground ministry. And instead of thinking the best roles in the church are the administrative roles, no, it's like, no, that's the structure that enables the real ministry to happen in the world. And so I'm excited that we're unleashing so many lay leaders in ministry in this model. But that's an image there of a framework of what this would look like. And again, the only thing that would be on a charge conference report that you, the DS, would have to sign and go and preside over is what? These 2 committees.
Yep.
The leadership board and nominations.
Yep. And Blake, if we could, I just want to chase one tiny squirrel here, because this is usually a point of confusion. Is we have begun to practice the role of the trustees committee as though they were the building maintenance team. We have practiced that probably for several decades now, as though that was a governance kind of committee. We put it as that governance committee, when really that is a ministry committee. And so when you pull those pieces apart, That's one of those disconnects when you start talking about simplified accountable structure, because trustees have spent the majority of their time talking about what needs to be repaired, what needs to be painted. That really happens as a ministry team. And those people that love to do that, God bless them. We can release them to do that. They don't have to have meetings anymore. We give them, procedures to release them and give them permission to spend money within healthy boundaries. It's like, talk about unleashing people. We unleash those
Sure.
guys, right? And so what truly is the governance pieces of trustees then gets lodged in the leadership board. And
Right.
so that's usually one of the misunderstandings or the confusions or I can't imagine pieces when you begin to talk about simplified structure. So that's why we specifically call that out in this organizational chart to try to help get at that from the very beginning.
And that is super. I as a pastor, I remember a trustee meeting where after about 15 minutes of talking about the stuff that was real actual trustee work, the liability and the insurance policy and stuff. It's like, okay, we have some light bulbs to change, and let me get my toolbox out. And then the last half of the meeting was toolboxes out, trying to repair stuff. Right. And that's really not the job of the board of trustees.
Correct.
And so by splitting that up and letting the governance be in the governance pot, and then having that building maintenance team, the folks with the toolboxes and all that, do that work, man, by separating, everyone is living in their spiritual gifts.
You bet. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah.
Now, I'll have one asterisk here as a superintendent, and that's some of my fellow colleagues here, superintendents. They look at it and they go, there's a leadership board that's supposed to serve all these. I'm supposed to go talk to staff parishes a lot and see preachers, and they have to fill out stuff. This feels a little challenging. Mm-hmm. And so I know you, in your experience, you've dealt with that a lot. And I think a lot of it comes not from the local church, because they can kind of get this. It's from superintendents, and we are kind of scared about the fact that we're losing our separate staff parish.
Yep.
And so what has you had some wisdom around that might be able to help out my fellow superintendents?
Yes, I do. Those 9 people that you talk to as a separate SPRC are still there. They are still there. They still have that same confidentiality responsibility. And I would say in the accountability model, they have more of a covenant than probably the traditional SPRC teams do now. They understand that role probably at a deeper level. And they are also speaking to you as the district superintendent on behalf of the entire church. So they have a wider scope of view and responsibility. As when they're talking to you, they're not talking to you from only an HR perspective. They're talking to you from the breadth and depth of the entire congregation, the life of the congregation. And so from a district superintendent standpoint, to me, again, this is life-giving. You have a better understanding of what's really going on when you are talking to a simplified accountable structure board rather than a piece of the church represented by simplified accountable structure. You go into executive session just like you do. So let's say you go through the regular agenda, and when you come to anything HR related, you go into executive session. And if there are any people there that aren't part of the leadership board, then they're excused and you go into closed session behind closed doors and you handle
the confidentiality veil comes down. Right. Yep. And when you as a superintendent meets with them, and the superintendent of course can meet with the staff parish without the pastor and then do the follow-up, that leadership group is the group you confidentially meet with.
Absolutely.
And really, you're right about the holistic viewpoint, because my experience has been when I meet with church councils, I get kind of a more holistic view. And then when I meet with staff parish, oftentimes every problem has an HR solution. It's like they all, because that's their job. Exactly. Their job is HR, it's personnel. It's like, well, how can we solve this with more staff? Or, well, maybe it's not a staffing issue.
Right.
Maybe it's a larger ministry issue or a facilities issue. And so this holistic board is able actually to give the superintendent a more holistic snapshot of what's going on in the church.
Well, it's the only tool they're given to work with. So
Oh, sure.
it has to have a HR solution, right?
One tool in the toolbox, and that's it.
Exactly. Everything looks like a nail because the hammer is the only tool they have.
You bet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, moving toward this, I know is not easy, Kay. And so we have, in the newest version of Mission Possible, changed the way we talk about the process, because it's not a light switch, is it?
Yeah. Yeah. And what we've learned, this is another learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is we've had to slow churches down because what's happened is like summertime, churches kind of like slumber through summer. Have you noticed that? And they wake up like in August and go, whoa, church conference. Like, I think you send out notices or something, right?
Right.
And they get this notice and go, church conference is coming up. And, we've kind of been thinking about moving structure and maybe we should do that. And so then they try to like rush it through and maybe they talk to church council or 2 or 3 people get together and think it's a good idea. And the DS goes, yeah, I'm for it. And so they fill out the new forms and 2 or 3 people might show up for church conference. It goes through. And then all of a sudden people go, what the heck happened?
Right.
And then there is mistrust in the new structure, right? Not that I'm not saying they were doing anything wrong or sneaky or trying to do it. It's just kind of the way it happened because of our system.
It's like, I used to be a trustee. Now I'm not. What happened? Did I miss an email?
Right. So what we believe is a much healthier process. So let's say you're going to go to the simplified structure in January of next year. The first quarter of the year prior is when you really start the discernment process. And that is where the church council says, we would like to explore. It's not, we're going to make the decision to do it. Is this the right model at the right time for our church? And then the church council, and this is one of Blake's beautiful pieces of work. I have to give you credit for that, of really working through some really great questions of getting to your why. What is your why? If it is a technical reason we want fewer meetings, if it's a technical reason we want fewer people, believe me, those are great reasons to move to this model, but we need also a deeper reason. What's the missional reason for doing so? And it really helps you get to that. So the first thing is for the council to really dig deep into the why. And then you get the church council will vote once they get to their why to explore. Then you invite the district superintendent for that preliminary conversation, because I think it's important to bring your DS in early into the conversation, because your DS may have information that would be important about this process. They may know something's coming in conference-wide. They may know about an appointment that maybe you don't know about yet. Or some leadership capacity around your current pastor that maybe isn't known yet. And then also, more and more conferences are moving to certified SAS coaches that are partners with district superintendents. And then they dispatch coaches to walk churches through this process. Instead of depending on a lay leader or a pastor who may not have any experience in this to actually walk them through it. It's kind of unfair to ask them to walk through a process that they've never been through. So that's kind of the discerning piece. You walk them through the discernment is not only the church council, but then this team is put together of not necessarily those on the council, but those kind of neutral parties, and they have informational conversations with the congregation. So the congregation is informed of really what the council is thinking, and they talk about the why. They share that why. They share what simplified accountable structure is and why they believe that this is something that the church should be considering. They answer questions that the congregation may have. We have some videos that we share with the congregation to give them some overviews so that they can actually hear from outside voices. And then that kind of feedback from all of those conversations from the discernment team. And we also have a prayer team that we get together as part of that. All of that feedback then goes back to the council. And then the council hears all of that and then decides if they want to make a formal request to actually move to the process. Okay. And then the DS, along with consultation with the coach, because the coach has been on the ground, right? And so they have some experience with what's really going on. Like, did they really do all of that? Did they shortchange the process? Because sometimes that happens.
Sure.
And then the DS makes the decision. Is this the right decision for this church? Because again, they have more, they might have some input that the church may not know. If the DS says yes, then we're recommending, and I think this is an important piece of this, right, Blake? A church conference. Again, it's because of the transparency, so that the church is saying yes to the structure. Okay. Then we talk about that difference of nominations, that a different kind of way of selecting leaders that goes into the equipping piece. And then it's the training of the new leadership board. And then we're also thinking about the implementation. What we're finding is that first year of living into that model is really important. If you don't have someone that is making sure that those guiding principles are in place, the leadership covenant is in place, that you're having a different conversation, you really are following a different agenda, you're staying in your governing lane instead of in the management lane, you are either bringing your old habits in to a new structure or you're creating new habits. And to have a coach there to walk with you will help you create your new habits. If you don't, we find that most often churches don't turn that corner. So the 3 distinct phases we have found to be very helpful in healthier transitions into it. And these 3 distinct phases seem to help the different teams know kind of what their role is, and when their role kind of their time comes into play for the different roles, and where the DS role comes into play as well. And we're going to break those DS points into play too. So we have found this to be really helpful.
It really is. I think about separating out into these 3 phases allows us not to get ahead of ourselves. Yeah. I still remember one of my pastors when I sat down and I shared with the model because they asked me to come, and I brought the version 2 book that I had, and then we talked about it, and they were like, let's go. I said, no. You have a process, and so let's work a process. So and then it was about a year later, I get a call from that pastor saying, oh, that process itself, working through the process, brought the church to a new level of mission and ministry and leadership.
It does.
They were prepared then to lead differently, not just have fewer people in meetings, but to lead in a new way. Yeah. And it was so exciting for him because that whole journey of equipping meant that the whole congregation came out on the other side more focused on the mission and ministry of the church and more accountable to each other.
Yep.
So yep. Now the first thing you talked about there was the why.
Yeah. And
I want to dig into that just a little bit more. Okay. Important. So superintendent here, I get applications to convert 247, I love it when, and we'll talk about this later. I have 2 points in it with initial and then a later. What I don't like is it's church conference season. I get a form and it's a little letter or an email saying, hey, I request change our structure. No, but usually when I get these phone calls, it's 2 subjects. we need fewer nominated leaders to, quote, fill slots.
Yep.
And that's often the words used. I don't have enough people to fill all the slots that want to do it.
Yep.
Okay, fair enough. And I'm not saying what size church. I've had good sized churches that don't have enough people that want to fill the slots,
Yep.
which is another subject.
Yep.
The other is a desire for fewer meetings, because it's like, oh, we are meetinged out. We are just meetinged out, and we see opportunities. They're running us by because we are just meetinged out. So that's the two reasons usually.
Mm-hmm.
But we think there's a little more going on underneath the surface, don't we?
Well, I think there's more potential than that. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yes. That's usually the presenting issues, but and those are the technical pieces.
Mm-hmm.
But what we find, and I'm not going to say that simplified accountable structure is a revitalization tool. I won't go that far. But like, I have worked with churches that this has been a leverage for revitalization.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we get to the point of actually having a governing body that is doing strategic work, that is doing that generative on the balcony kind of conversations, that is doing the accountability of, are we really making disciples? What should we be doing to make disciples? It causes us to have different conversations and make different decisions, right? And so those are the things, those adaptive changes that this model brings about through the accountability pieces. And again, I mean, we go back to, accountability is key in this model, and why we don't believe that simplification without accountability is the way to go. Everything hinges back to the mission. I often say that in most church council meetings, Jesus is mentioned twice, and it's usually the pastor, and it's at the beginning and the end in the prayer, in Jesus' name, amen. And I mean, we laugh about it, but it also breaks my heart, because it's all about the busyness of the church. And we've come to think that our calendars being full means that we're a healthy church. But yet, look at the decline of the church. And I believe it's because we've just lost our way, because we haven't figured, we've lost our focus, right? And the board has this responsibility of, okay, so if we are responsible for our church living out its mission, then our responsibility is to leverage all the assets towards that mission, right? So how do we help leverage? I often say, just to put this into perspective, I don't mean to scare leaders, but you are accountable to Christ for this church making disciples. I mean, think about that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's huge. It's huge.
Is.
Well, the accountability being held to the impact of the church in the world. Are we making a God-sized impact in the world, or are we just keeping the trains running on time?
Right. Or even, and I even wonder about that.
If we're lucky on that.
Exactly. And because we are not running everything through 4 or sometimes more committees, we are able to be much more nimble, adaptable, and really live in the 21st century of leadership, like most other organizations are, through this particular model, more so than anything else. But if all we do is see it as fewer meetings with fewer people around the table, we're not going to get to that point of being nimble and flexible, because we're just bringing our old habits to a smaller table and fewer meetings.
Sure.
Right?
That nimble adaptability, I'll tell you what, this last year, we're filming this on the heels of the 2020 pandemic that's now run into 2021. And I've had church leaders who said, if we had not switched over to this new structure and gotten used to it now, I don't know how we could have made it through, because we had to make decisions so incredibly quickly, and taking information at different levels, come up with new ideas, adapt quickly. If we had to run it through 4 committees, we would have lost ground for the kingdom of God.
Okay.
And because they changed their structure, they were able to make Christ-centered missional decisions very quickly in a time when being a nimble leadership team was a must. It wasn't a luxury. It was a requirement
You bet.
there. And so we've talked a lot about accountability, and we have another slide here about accountable leadership strengths. Because remember, that's that big A in the center is simply accountable structure. And the first item on this, I want you to share on it some, but the first item, merit, responsibility, and authority, I still remember, I guess it was one of my associate pastor day positions, when I was one of those. I thought, man, I got a lot of responsibility. I've got zero authority in this role. Now, at that time, it was probably for the best. That was early in my ministry, but that's not a way to move in life, really, is it?
It is. It is
So,
not.
so why do we focus so much on accountability, not just fewer people around the table, but really doing it differently? Why is that so central to what we do?
Um, be, because most of the time, we give people, like your example is, we like say, we really want you to do this, but boy, it's like we still harness you that we don't really mean it. Um, and so we strap you with all of these requirements that make it so cumbersome to have to go to 4 committees, like we said, or our example of that Easter, egg party, that takes 7 months to get something. People, so in your example earlier, to say a large church still sometimes can't get all the administrative teams filled because they're so frustrated with the cumbersome leadership process that we have. They're like, I'm sitting out. This is so crazy that I don't want to be a part of this leadership. Um, so it allows that adaptability. It's like, okay, if you're going to give me responsibility, then give me the tools that I need to actually do it. Let me fail, but let me do it with some authority at least, right? And when we have accountable leadership, at least we know what the game is, right? When we don't practice accountable leadership, we're not always sure what game we're playing or what the rules are, because they're like kept secret. Because if we reveal everything, then boy, we're giving away some power. And
Mhm.
sometimes that's the way that people control, and sometimes even in the church, right? But it has to function on a high level of trust, because we're also then turning around and having those accountability. We cannot be afraid of accountability conversations in the church. I think sometimes we confuse being kind with accountable leadership. So it's like we can't hold people accountable because that's not being kind. Have
Mm.
you heard that before, Blake?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I may have heard that.
And I think it's sometimes, and as a matter of fact, I think it's unkind not to be accountable in the church, because you are putting people in places where they're not fruitful. They know that. They feel that. Let's get them in a place where they thrive. That's our responsibility, I think, is to allow people to thrive in ministry. And so when we have a clear understanding of where we're all going, we're all kind of rowing in the same direction, and there's unity, there's excitement, there's momentum in all of that. We actually have an accountability video that we did just to do some of those kind of examples, because I think it's hard to know what it looks like and feels like. And it's empowering, though, at the same time, because I think accountability sometimes feels punitive. It feels like punishment. I think in our head, that's the way we relate it. But it really is about, how can we be supportive? How can we be encouraging? How can we help you troubleshoot, find a solution, find the next step forward? But we're just not going to sit by and say under our breath or in the parking lot, like, oh my gosh, that pastor is like not moving forward whatsoever. But, I didn't want to say anything. He's our pastor after all. But you're frustrated, but you're not willing to say anything, right? This allows us to say, hey, pastor, we've had this goal, it's halfway through the year. We haven't seen any movement. can you help us understand, what's getting in the way? How can we be helpful here? Right. And I think that is kind of naming it, but also to say, but we're here to help.
Right.
We're here to help. We're here to encourage. It's not about, I always say, it's not about the club over the head. That is not what this is about, right? And so it isn't about just a performance piece. This is about, we're all trying to get to this mission and vision fulfillment. That's what it's all about, right?
It outlines the goal. I mean,
Exactly.
because right now, most of our committees, it's sort of a blob of accountability.
Oh,
We have all these different committees functioning, and no one quite knows where the border between their committee and another committee starts and ends. And I dealt with that as pastor and as a superintendent going, so are we in charge of this or they or well, and discipline sometimes is not helpful. It kind of says both. And so when everyone is accountable, no one is accountable.
correct.
It becomes a blob of accountability, and so it doesn't really, there's no really way to find a handle. The other thing with that blob is I think of, if you think of sports metaphors and stuff, if you don't know where the goal is, you'll never reach it. If you don't know where the basketball net is, you'll never land a basket. And so what we're doing here is trying to outline and clarify all these pieces, and then be really clear who the team is responsible for getting that ball in the basket.
Right. And ultimately, who the person, right? It's hard to hold a committee accountable. Ultimately, it's who's the person that is accountable, team leaders, pastor, and so on. And I think that's really helpful when ultimately we know one of the activities we love to do in workshops is to say to our boards or leaders to say, would you draw your current organizational chart of your church? And then have them compare. Oh, it is so fun. It's like, would y'all like hold those up and let's all compare? There is no two alike ever. And it's like, okay, you're the leaders and you don't know how the flow of decision making is done. What do you think your congregation thinks then? How do they navigate the way that decisions are made? It is so complicated, you don't understand it. And then the ministry teams, they don't, if you ask any ministry team that's been around for more than a couple of years, like, so what's the intended outcome of this ministry? Most often they don't have a common understanding of their outcome either. So when we have these understood goals and objectives and all of this alignment, everybody just kind of knows what they're supposed to do and how it fits into the bigger picture. So they see their part, how it plays into the bigger picture. And so they know what role they're playing that's helping all of us move forward. And that's an empowering piece that motivates everyone that's a part of it too. And then we can all adjust as needed.
Super. So, Kay, we have been recommending this process for churches for some years now. Yeah. And of recent, we've discovered some stuff about how we work with local churches, we work with superintendents, conferences. We've noticed something that we really advise now moving toward a conference-wide approach when it comes to simplified accountable structure. And the reasoning behind that, so you see this, the why here, is because I'll use my own example. Arkansas did not come in with a conference-wide approach because what people did was they had friends who were using it in different conferences and around the country, and stuff they had read here or there, or stuff they'd heard about, or they heard about someone who did it, or heard about someone who heard about someone, kind of playing telephone, and they built all these different systems. So when I came into the superintendent, there was not a conference. There was, I have 100 churches. Several of them have simplified structure. No two were even closely alike.
Right.
None of them were used the same language. It was very challenging as a superintendent to be walking into these systems that were so divergent. Yeah. And so when we talk about why implement a conference-wide approach, and it's not just to make it easier on the superintendent, although it does. It really, really does.
Yeah.
The first is to create that shared vocabulary, create a common implementation process and practice. It's not helpful in a conference if the churches in my district I have an expectation that you run through all three phases and you work it this way. If one of my colleagues on the cabinet were to say, "Oh, yeah, you can just switch that fall, just let me know. And oh, by the way, I need a separate staff parish committee." Whoa, whoa, whoa. That's not helpful because remember, we moved pastors. And so, but if
And
you
we
have a,
move DSs sometimes too, don't we, Blake?
oh, I know. I was at one district and now I moved to another one. I just got moved in this week. So yeah, that happens. And so there's all these different changes. So, but if you have a common vocabulary and implementation practice model for the conference, that makes it a lot more interchangeable. That way, when you have district and conference equipping events for clergy and laity, we're all using the same words. We're all building with the same models. Now, of course, there'll be contextual differences. Of course, there will be. We want there to be, but we're all starting with the same basic structure and superstructure of the system and the same words. When it comes to coaching, when conferences have certified coaches, that means the coaches know when we go into the conference, here's our baseline expectations and here's our processes. And so those could all be common. You don't want to be running imperial and metric and then several other versions all in the same kind. It's just not helpful. Laity from different congregations, when they get together and talk about their simplified structure,
And they do.
It's a lot easier when they're all using the same words and they understand and they can learn from each other. But if you start having all these divergent systems, that means it'll erode some of that commonality that will hold this stuff together. And then also it'll create consistency when new pastors and DSs are appointed. And we recommend intentional simplified accountable structure training for clergy if they're going to a church with that structure, because I've seen a couple of different things happen. Now, I've got an image on this and you see what you think. Here's a clergy transition right here. This is actually from the movie Speed, and this is, I used to do the baton and I still got a baton around here, pass the baton. I think I'm going to give up the baton and instead stick with this image. You're on one bus, you're moving to another bus, they're going 60 miles per hour and one of them might blow up. That feels like a clergy transition.
It's more appropriate.
It really is. But when you get in these clergy transitions, I've seen a couple of things. One was a pastor was really engaged in the process, him or herself, moved to a new church. The church, because they had not done the discernment and equipping and implementation phases, they just sort of hopped into it. Their actual phrase to me, and I put it in the book, said, "We have a sports car of a structure, but none of us know how to drive stick." They didn't know how to work it. And then the new pastor went in and she had never dealt with it before. And they were asking, "Can we just go back? Because none of us," and that just breaks my heart because they did some hard work there. They were almost there, but that's why the process matters and the coaching and the new pastor training all matters. Because if not, the bus will blow up eventually, I suppose.
So true.
What a visual, huh?
Yeah.
But so conference-wide approaches, though, that's a lot of the why. Kay, you've been working with a lot of conferences that have decided to move conference-wide on this approach. And I know in the last couple of years, you and other coaches you're training, you've been learning a lot on how to do this. Could you share with our superintendent some of these most recent learnings and research?
Last fall, actually started doing a nationwide coach certification process for SAS because we were seeing this need of how to partner with DSs because DSs don't have the time or the capacity as districts are getting bigger in geographically and bigger in number of churches that they're responsible for to walk through all of those steps. And as we know, if we don't walk through those three phases, then it's not going to be a successful implementation of SAS. So, what's the approach here? So we knew we needed to create some partners, but we also knew that we needed some thorough training. So we created a certified SaaS process. But we also knew that we couldn't just have, coaches kind of helicoptering. We needed that integrated into kind of conference culture as well. And so how do we model that at the conference level? Accountability at all levels. So if we're going to have a coach approach, then we want to make sure that the SaaS coaches are being held accountable for all of the steps by the conference that they're working in, right? That they're actually working the process. So often we have churches that start off strong maybe, and all of those first 9 leaders are trained, but then we don't have any other training after that. And so in 3 years, guess what? We got leaders that haven't been trained that are working simplified structure. And so they haven't been trained. So they're bringing all of the old stuff, because that's all they know of the old model, back. And before long, we're right back to where we were with the old agenda and the old way of doing things. We're looking for conference-wide consistency, again, in that language. The coach certification allows the coach to bring in all of those consistencies and training. They have access to our resources. So anytime we update anything, we have a shared base camp where if I change a slide, they have instant access to anything that Blake or I change. They have instant access to it. So it's not like you're trying to get to everybody. They have that way to get to us, if you will. It helps when we're working with conferences. They just have those processes and protocols, and then they know what their local conference expectations are, so that all the DSs are kind of working in the same way. And so when a new DS comes in, this is just how we do it, instead of the DS having to try to figure out how they're going to interpret the book of discipline, right? Because again, there is so much ambiguity in that 247.2. Just like when you went in, there was no consistent conference. Every church was doing it differently. You could have every DS doing it differently. So when you have a conference approach, then the new DSs just kind of come in and pick up whatever the conference is doing, right?
Well, especially as many of our superintendents, my fellow superintendents, we may have not ever had this in a local church.
In a local church.
We may not have personal experience in this model before coming on the cabinet.
Correct.
And because it's not, it's in the book of discipline with some options,
yep,
but not laid out well.
Yep.
Unless you know the system really well, you may not know, for instance, a nominating committee has to be independent and separate.
Correct.
Which is that I met my first month on the job of the superintendent, and it was a committee, a board that kept on renominating themselves every single year.
Oh, yeah.
And, they didn't know better. And the superintendent, we didn't know. Well, when you have a conference-wide clear structure and interpretation,
you would know.
All that is handled in advance.
You would know, right? Exactly. You would know. And so it's one less thing that the DS would have to come in and figure out. So it's almost like a gift, right? The other thing that we found out is it's really helpful for the nominations form to have a separate nominations form, charge conference form for simplified accountable structure than the traditional. When we try to have churches put the simplified structure in a traditional form, it really messes them up, right? And you're trying to put a square peg in a round hole, and then they get confused and go, okay, did we not do this right? Or you do SPRC training in the traditional model and require SaaS people to come to that training, then they walk away and go, are we not doing that right? Because they just told me we have to have an SPRC separate team, right? That happened.
Right.
The other thing I would say is, to your other point, Blake, is there are some conferences that simplified accountable structure is mainstream. There are other conferences that are just starting to dip their toe in it. I mean, there's all sorts of right. implementation of this model across our connection in all different ways. So, and then I think it's helpful for our the cabinets and developers. We want them to have some sort of a way to manage the whole coaching system for their conference, because we want that to have a consistent way to roll out and be those partners for the DSs, because I think that's really important for the DSs to feel like it's a collaborative partner, that it's a helpmate, that they can depend on that SAS coach to be the eyes and ears for them. And they can depend on them to be that dispatched person for them. But there has to be some accountability of that coach for that coach in order for that to work. So there has to be a system in place for that.
You bet. You bet. Okay, so we have covered a lot in this introduction. I know it felt like, but that's what charm school, I have to say, when I was at Junaluska and did charm school, that's what it felt like. It was every day was a fire hose, and that's what it feels like for most of these resources when you're a new superintendent. And so we understand. But we wanted to give you enough of a background so you have some basic understanding of the dynamics involved. Of course, it all ties into Mission Possible, which we'll tell you a little more about in later videos. And this is the first of a series of videos that we'll have for you all and the superintendents. Kay, what all did we do so far in this hour?
Just like always, we started with the why, right?
Yeah.
And we didn't make it up. It's in the discipline. Mm-hmm. It covered kind of this new thing that we're doing, slow it down. And there are 3 distinct phases: the discerning phase, the equipping phase, and the implementing phase. The discerning and the implementing phase are in year 1, and the implementing phase is in year 2. This is both a technical and an adaptive approach to structure. And a conference-wide approach is where it's at, makes all the difference in the world. And we've learned that the hard way. Highly recommend it. It does make a difference. So that was a lot that we covered in part 1, but we hope that it's been helpful to give you the introduction to simplified accountable structure. Join us for part 2.